Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the cold, dark hours of January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII Tudor, once the epitome of princely vigor and Renaissance splendor, breathed his last at Whitehall Palace. The 55-year-old monarch, whose frame had ballooned to nearly 28 stone, approximately 400 pounds, lay immobile, his legs festering with ulcers so putrid that courtiers could smell him approaching from 3 rooms away. This grotesque transformation from athletic young prince to morbidly obese tyrant has fascinated historians for centuries, presenting one of history's most dramatic physical and psychological deteriorations. In the winter of his life, when pain and paranoia had become his constant companions, the king was but a shadow of his former self, carried from chamber to chamber, unable to walk, his body a prison of his own making, wrote the Spanish ambassador in a dispatch to Emperor Charles V. The death of Henry VIII marked not just the end of a man, but the conclusion of an era that had transformed England's religious, political, and social landscape beyond recognition. What forces drove this remarkable metamorphosis? How did the handsome, athletic young king who ascended the throne in 1509 become the bloated, paranoid, and tyrannical figure who died in 1547? What medical conditions plagued his final years, and what impact did his declining health have on his governance and legacy? This narrative explores the bizarre death of Henry VIII Tudor, not merely as a medical case study, but as a complex tapestry of political intrigue, religious upheaval, personal trauma, and medical mystery that continues to captivate our imagination nearly 5 centuries later. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491 at Greenwich Palace, the 3rd child and 2nd son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His birth represented the physical embodiment of the union between the houses of Lancaster and York, a living symbol of the peace that followed the bloody Wars of the Roses. Yet as a 2nd son, young Henry was not initially destined for the throne. That honor belonged to his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Educated in the humanist tradition by some of Europe's finest scholars, Henry grew into a Renaissance prince par excellence. He was tall and athletic, with a ruddy complexion and auburn hair, the very picture of kingly vigor. Contemporary accounts describe a young man accomplished in languages, theology, mathematics, and music. He composed songs, wrote theological treatises, and excelled at sports, particularly jousting, tennis, and hunting. His Majesty is the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, wrote the Venetian ambassador in 1515. Above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion fair and bright, with auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. Henry's path to the throne was cleared by tragedy. In April 1502, his brother Arthur died unexpectedly at Ludlow Castle, likely from sweating sickness or tuberculosis. At just 10 years old, Henry became heir to the English throne. His father, Henry VII, ever cautious and calculating, kept his remaining son under close watch, limiting his participation in the dangerous pursuits common to young noblemen. When Henry VII died on April 21, 1509, the 17-year-old Henry VIII ascended the throne with unbridled enthusiasm. His coronation on June 24, 1509, marked the beginning of what contemporaries hoped would be a glorious new era. Within weeks of his father's death, Henry fulfilled a long-standing betrothal by marrying Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow. The match required a papal dispensation, as marrying one's brother's widow was prohibited under canon law. This dispensation would later become central to the king's great matter, his quest to annul his marriage to Catherine. The early years of Henry's reign seemed to fulfill the promise of his youth. He surrounded himself with learned men like Sir Thomas More and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. He authored a defense of Catholic sacraments against Martin Luther's Protestant ideas, earning him the papal title Defender of the Faith, an irony given his later break with Rome. The young king's court was a center of culture, learning, and entertainment. Henry spent lavishly on tournaments, masques, and hunts. He expanded the Royal Navy, built impressive palaces, and commissioned works from artists like Hans Holbein the Younger. He and Catherine appeared to enjoy a harmonious marriage, though the Queen's inability to produce a male heir increasingly troubled the king. In 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, Henry, but the infant died after just 52 days. This was the first of many reproductive tragedies for the royal couple. Catherine would suffer multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, producing only one child who survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. By the 1520s, Henry's frustration over the lack of a male heir had grown acute. The Tudor dynasty, established only in 1485 when Henry's father seized the throne, still felt precarious. Without a male heir, Henry feared England might descend back into civil war after his death. This concern, combined with his passionate infatuation with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, would set in motion the events that would transform both the king and his kingdom. During his first 2 decades on the throne, Henry maintained his reputation as an athletic and vigorous monarch. Court records reveal his enthusiasm for physical pursuits. He would hunt for hours, sometimes covering up to 30 miles in a day. He excelled at tennis, wrestling, and archery. Above all, he loved jousting, a dangerous sport that pitted armored men against each other on horseback with lances. Sir Thomas Knollys, a courtier, wrote, "His Grace runs at the ring, plays at tennis, and jousts daily, showing such vigor and agility as to astonish those who had not seen him these past years." This athletic prowess was not merely for pleasure. It was a crucial aspect of kingship in Tudor England. The king's physical strength symbolized the strength of the realm itself. Henry's impressive stature, he stood over 6 feet tall at a time when the average Englishman was several inches shorter, and his athletic accomplishments reinforced his image as a powerful ruler capable of defending his kingdom. Yet even during these early years, there were hints of the health problems that would later plague him. Court records mention an episode in 1521 when the king was indisposed with a humor in his leg, likely an early manifestation of the ulcers that would torment him in later life. In 1527, he suffered what was described as a tertian ache, likely malaria, that left him temporarily weakened. These episodes, however, did not significantly diminish the king's vitality or his public image as the embodiment of regal power. That transformation would begin in earnest after 1536, when a series of personal, political, and physical crises converged to alter the king's body and temperament in profound ways. By the mid-1520s, Henry had become convinced that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was cursed. The queen, now in her 40s, was unlikely to bear more children. The king's advisors, particularly Cardinal Wolsey, began exploring ways to annul the marriage, allowing Henry to wed a younger woman who might give him a son. The quest for an annulment, which Henry termed his great matter, soon became complicated by politics and passion. Pope Clement VII, effectively under the control of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was reluctant to grant Henry's request. Meanwhile, the king had fallen deeply in love with Anne Boleyn, a sophisticated and educated lady-in-waiting who refused to become merely the king's mistress, insisting on marriage. When diplomatic efforts failed to secure an annulment, Henry took the radical step of breaking England's centuries-old ties with the Roman Catholic Church. Between 1532 and 1534, Parliament passed a series of acts severing papal authority in England and establishing the king as supreme head of the Church of England. This religious revolution, known as the English Reformation, would profoundly alter the nation's spiritual, political, and social landscape. The break with Rome enabled Henry to annul his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne, who was crowned queen in June 1533. 3 months later, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, disappointing Henry's hopes for a son. By 1536, after Anne had suffered at least one miscarriage, Henry's affections had cooled and court factions aligned against her. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. Accusations most historians now view as fabricated. She was beheaded on May 19, 1536, and Henry married Jane Seymour the following day. This rapid sequence of events, the execution of one queen and the immediate marriage to another, shocked even Henry's contemporaries, suggesting a king increasingly detached from normal human sentiment. The year 1536 represents a critical turning point in Henry's life and reign. In January, while jousting at Greenwich, the 44-year-old king suffered a catastrophic fall when his horse collapsed beneath him. He remained unconscious for 2 hours, a period long enough to suggest significant brain trauma. This accident, largely overlooked by earlier historians, has gained increasing attention as a potential catalyst for the king's subsequent physical and psychological deterioration. The jousting accident was just the beginning of Henry's annus horribilis. When news of his accident reached Anne Boleyn, the pregnant queen reportedly miscarried a male fetus, a devastating blow to the king's hopes for an heir. In May, Anne was executed. Although Henry married Jane Seymour immediately after, his emotional state appears to have been deeply affected by the tumultuous events of these months. Later that year, a popular uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in northern England. This rebellion, triggered by religious reforms and economic grievances, represented the most serious threat to Henry's rule. Though initially offering pardons to the rebels, Henry later ordered brutal reprisals, executing hundreds of participants. This vengeful response reflected a hardening in the king's character. By year's end, Henry had secured parliamentary approval for the dissolution of England's monasteries, a massive transfer of wealth and property from church to crown that would help finance his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The monasteries had also provided crucial social services, including healthcare and education, and their dissolution created significant hardships for many communities. The traumatic events of 1536 appear to have accelerated changes in Henry's physical health and temperament. Contemporaries noted his increasing irritability, unpredictability, and cruelty. His waistline expanded noticeably, and the leg ulcer that had troubled him occasionally in earlier years became a persistent, painful condition. The dashing young king, who had once been the envy of Europe, was beginning his transformation into the fearsome tyrant of his later years. The birth of a son remained Henry's obsession throughout these turbulent years. In October 1537, Queen Jane Seymour finally fulfilled this desperate wish by giving birth to a male heir, the future Edward VI. The king's joy, however, was short-lived. 12 days after the delivery, Jane died of puerperal fever, leaving Henry genuinely grief-stricken. He would later request to be buried beside her, the only one of his 6 wives to receive this honor. Following Jane's death, Henry remained unmarried for over 2 years, his longest period of bachelorhood since ascending the throne. When he did remarry in January 1540, the match with Anne of Cleves proved disastrous. Henry, who had seen only a flattering portrait of the German princess, was dismayed by her appearance in person. The marriage was never consummated and was annulled after just 6 months. In July 1540, the 49-year-old king married the teenaged Catherine Howard, cousin to Anne Boleyn. For a brief period, Catherine's youth and vitality seemed to rejuvenate the aging king. But in November 1541, evidence emerged of Catherine's infidelities, both before and during her marriage to Henry. The king, who had publicly thanked God for such a perfect jewel of womanhood, was devastated. Catherine was beheaded in February 1542. Henry's final marriage to the twice-widowed Catherine Parr in 1543 brought a measure of stability to his personal life. The intelligent and diplomatic Catherine served as a companion and nurse to the increasingly infirm king, while also acting as stepmother to his children. By this point, Henry had secured the Tudor succession through his son Edward, but concerns about the boy's health prompted Parliament to pass the Third Succession Act in 1544, which restored Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession after Edward. This pragmatic acknowledgement that his daughters might need to rule demonstrates Henry's growing recognition of his own mortality. The physical transformation of Henry VIII ranks among history's most dramatic royal metamorphoses. The athletic young king, who had astonished ambassadors with his vigor, gradually became so obese that by the 1540s he required mechanical assistance to move between floors of his palaces. This transformation is vividly documented through Henry's armor, which provides precise measurements of his body at different stages of his life. In his 20s, Henry had a 32-inch waist and 39-inch chest. By his 50s, his waist had expanded to 52 inches, and contemporary accounts suggest he weighed approximately 28 stone, about 400 pounds at the time of his death. The king's diet contributed significantly to this weight gain. Court records detailed the enormous quantities of food served at the royal table. A typical daily menu for Henry in the 1540s included multiple courses of fish, fowl, and game, accompanied by rich sauces, pastries, and sweet confections, all washed down with gallons of ale and wine. The Ordinances of Eltham, drawn up in 1526, specified detailed instructions for what should be served to the king each day, documenting his massive appetite for meat, pastries, and wine. His Majesty is very stout and marvelously excessive in eating and drinking, reported the French ambassador in 1541, so that people worth credit say he is often of a different opinion in the morning than after dinner. Henry's immobility exacerbated his weight problem. As his leg ulcers worsened, he became increasingly sedentary, abandoning the physical activities that had once defined his daily routine. By the 1540s, he was being transported around his palaces in chairs called trams, an early form of wheelchair. Edward Hall, a contemporary chronicler, recorded that the king could not go up or down stairs unless he was raised up or let down by engine, likely some form of pulley or hoist. Perhaps the most debilitating of Henry's physical ailments were the chronic ulcers that afflicted his legs. These ulcers, which modern medical historians believe may have resulted from varicose veins, osteomyelitis, or perhaps diabetes, caused the king constant pain and significantly limited his mobility. The condition appears to have begun around 1527, when court records mention an ulcer on the king's leg that required treatment by Thomas Vicary, who later became Henry's sergeant surgeon. After the king's jousting accident in 1536, the condition worsened dramatically, with ulcers developing on both legs. By the 1540s, these ulcers had become a persistent torment. They would periodically close over, trapping infection beneath the skin and causing episodes of fever and extreme pain. The king's physicians attempted to keep the ulcers open to allow drainage, often using red-hot pokers to lance them, a treatment that can only have added to Henry's suffering and likely contributed to his notorious temper. The stench from these infected wounds was reportedly so powerful that it could be detected 3 rooms away, announcing the king's approach before he was visible. Despite this humiliating condition, Henry continued to travel, refusing to rest despite his physician's advice. In 1541, he wrote to the Duke of Norfolk, explaining his limited travel. "To be frank with you, which you must keep to yourself, a humor has fallen into our legs, and our physicians advise us not to go far in the heat of the day." The king's determination to maintain an appearance of strength despite his deteriorating health is evident in his continued participation in state activities. Even in 1544, at the age of 53 and severely impaired by his ulcerated legs, Henry personally traveled to France to oversee the siege of Boulogne. This insistence on demonstrating royal power despite physical limitations reflects both Henry's strong sense of kingly duty and perhaps his denial of his own mortality. The constant pain from Henry's various ailments likely affected his mental state and decision-making abilities. Tudor medicine had limited options for pain management, relying primarily on alcohol, opiates derived from poppies, and herbal preparations with varying degrees of efficacy. Court records indicate that the king's physicians prepared various concoctions to ease his suffering, including drowsy syrups that contained opium. These medications, while providing temporary relief, may have contributed to Henry's increasingly erratic behavior and mood swings in his later years. Beyond physical pain, Henry suffered psychological trauma from his jousting accident in 1536. Some medical historians have suggested that this injury caused traumatic brain injury that contributed to his personality changes. The king, who had once been praised for his affability and justice, became increasingly paranoid, vindictive, and cruel after 1536. The execution of close friends and advisors like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, along with the brutal suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, reflect a ruler increasingly divorced from the humanist principles of his youth. By the 1540s, Henry had largely withdrawn from public view, spending more time in his private chambers and less time engaging with courtiers. Ambassadors noted his reluctance to grant audiences, and when he did appear in public, he often required assistance to stand or move. This physical diminishment contrasted sharply with the carefully cultivated image of kingly power that had defined the early years of his reign. "The king's life was really thought in danger," wrote an observer in 1541, "not from the fever, but from the leg, which often troubles him because he is very stout and marvelously excessive in eating and drinking, so that people worth credit say he is often of a different opinion in the morning than after dinner." As his health deteriorated, Henry became increasingly concerned with his legacy and the stability of the Tudor dynasty. This preoccupation manifested in his final will and testament, which carefully delineated the succession and established a regency council to govern during his son Edward's minority. Even as his body failed him, the king remained determined to maintain control over the future of his kingdom. By the autumn of 1546, Henry's health had deteriorated significantly. He had grown so corpulent that he could barely move without assistance. His legs, chronically ulcerated and infected, caused him constant pain. Despite these afflictions, the king continued to attend to state business, though increasingly from the confines of his private chambers. In December 1546, Henry's condition worsened. Unable to walk due to his grossly swollen legs and extreme obesity, he was carried around Whitehall Palace in a chair. His physicians, increasingly concerned about his prognosis, attempted various treatments, including cauterizing his leg ulcers with hot irons, a procedure that caused excruciating pain but failed to improve his condition. As Christmas approached, the king rallied briefly, participating in seasonal festivities and receiving ambassadors. But by early January, it was clear to those around him that Henry was failing rapidly. Bouts of fever, likely resulting from the systemic infection spreading from his leg ulcers, left him weakened and often confused. The king's condition became a matter of intense political concern. The future Edward VI was only 9 years old, necessitating a regency government until he reached maturity. Various factions at court, led by the conservative Duke of Norfolk and the reformist Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle, maneuvered for advantage as the king's death appeared imminent. Henry, aware of these machinations even in his weakened state, ordered the arrest of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, on charges of treason. Surrey was executed on January 19, 1547, while Norfolk was saved only by the king's death before his scheduled execution. As January 1547 drew to a close, Henry's physicians acknowledged that nothing more could be done to save the king. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to the royal bedside, but by tradition, no one dared inform the king directly that his death was imminent. To suggest that the monarch was mortal remained treasonous. According to contemporary accounts, Cranmer asked Henry to give some sign that he trusted in Christ's mercy. The dying king, no longer able to speak clearly, reportedly squeezed the archbishop's hand in response. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old and had ruled England for nearly 38 years. The king's death was kept secret for 3 days, while the Regency Council secured young Edward's position and arranged the transition of power. Only on January 31st was the news of Henry's death publicly announced, simultaneously with his son's accession as Edward VI. Henry's funeral reflected the grandeur and contradictions of his reign. Despite having broken with Rome and established himself as head of the English Church, Henry had maintained many traditional Catholic practices. His funeral service, held at Windsor on February 16, 1547, combined elements of both old and new religious customs. The king's enormous coffin, specially constructed to accommodate his immense girth, was transported from Whitehall to Windsor in a solemn procession that included over 1,000 mourners. The funeral effigy that accompanied the coffin depicted Henry as he wished to be remembered, regal, powerful, and imposing, rather than the bloated, infirm figure he had become. In accordance with his wishes, Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the mother of his son and heir. The planned magnificent tomb monument, commissioned from Italian sculptor Benedetto da Rovezzano, was never completed due to the political and religious upheavals that followed Henry's death. News of Henry's death prompted varied reactions across Europe. In Rome, where he had once been hailed as defender of the faith before breaking with the Catholic Church, there was muted satisfaction. In France and Spain, strategic calculations about England's future direction under a child king dominated diplomatic correspondence. Within England, the transition of power proceeded more smoothly than many had anticipated. Edward Seymour, the young king's maternal uncle, quickly established himself as Lord Protector, effectively ruling England during Edward's minority. The Regency Council, established according to Henry's will, initially accepted Seymour's leadership, though factional disputes would soon emerge. For the common people of England, Henry's death marked the end of a transformative era. The king, who had ruled for nearly 4 decades, had fundamentally altered the religious, political, and social landscape of the realm. The dissolution of the monasteries, the break with Rome, the expansion of royal authority, and the establishment of the Tudor dynasty as a seemingly secure institution, all these changes had occurred within living memory, largely driven by the will of the man now being laid to rest at Windsor. Tudor medicine, operating within the framework of Galenic theory, attributed Henry's health problems primarily to an imbalance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The king's physicians, among the most learned men of their age, treated his various ailments according to this paradigm. The leg ulcers that tormented Henry were understood as the body's attempt to expel excess humors. When these ulcers occasionally healed over, trapping the humors inside, the king would experience fever and extreme discomfort. This explains why his physicians attempted to keep the ulcers open, often using painful cautery procedures. A French ambassador reported in 1538 that when the ulcers closed, for 10 to 12 days the humors which had no outlet were like to have stifled him, so that he was sometime without speaking, black in the face, and in great danger. Contemporary accounts also noted the king's prodigious appetite and its apparent effects on his temperament. As mentioned earlier, observers commented that Henry was often of a different opinion in the morning than after dinner, suggesting recognition of a connection between his diet and his mood swings. The king's physicians, limited by the medical knowledge of their time, focused primarily on managing symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes. Their treatments, bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices and ointments, likely provided little real relief, and may in some cases have exacerbated Henry's conditions. Modern medical historians have proposed numerous retrospective diagnoses for Henry VIII, attempting to explain both his physical deterioration and his psychological transformation. These theories include: 1. Type 2 diabetes. Henry's obesity, particularly his central adiposity, fat accumulation around the waist, combined with his diet rich in sugars and carbohydrates, suggests he may have developed type 2 diabetes. This would explain his leg ulcers, as diabetes impairs wound healing and increases susceptibility to infections. It might also account for some of his mood swings, as fluctuating blood sugar levels can affect cognitive function and temperament. Number 2. Traumatic brain injury. The king's 1536 jousting accident, which left him unconscious for 2 hours, may have caused significant brain trauma. Some medical historians argue that this injury could explain the marked change in Henry's personality after 1536. Symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury, including irritability, impulsivity, memory problems, and personality changes, align with the observed transformation in the king's behavior. Number 3. Cushing's syndrome. This endocrine disorder, characterized by excessive cortisol production, causes central obesity, muscle weakness, mood swings, and impaired wound healing, all symptoms exhibited by Henry in his later years. Cushing's syndrome can result from prolonged use of steroid medications unlikely in Tudor times, or from tumors affecting the pituitary or adrenal glands. Number 4. Syphilis. Once a popular theory, the idea that Henry suffered from syphilis has largely been discounted by modern historians. While syphilis was certainly present in Tudor England, and the disease can cause personality changes and ulceration in its tertiary stage, Henry showed few of the other characteristic symptoms of advanced syphilis, such as distinctive skin lesions or neurological impairments like tabes dorsalis. 5. Malaria. Records indicate that Henry suffered from periodic fevers consistent with malaria, a disease present in Tudor England, particularly in the marshy areas around London. While malaria itself would not explain his obesity or personality changes, recurrent malarial infections could have weakened his overall health and contributed to his decline. Verse 6. McLeod syndrome. A more recent theory suggests Henry may have had McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that affects blood group antigens. This syndrome can cause movement disorders, psychiatric symptoms, and cognitive decline, potentially explaining some of the king's behavioral changes. Proponents of this theory point to Henry's reproductive history, including Catherine of Aragon's multiple miscarriages, as possible evidence of a genetic blood group incompatibility. Most likely, Henry's deterioration resulted from a combination of these factors, rather than a single condition. His obesity led to or exacerbated other health problems, creating a cascade of declining physical and mental health that transformed the once vigorous king into the infirm, irascible tyrant of his final years. While contemporary records do not specify an exact cause of death, modern medical historians generally agree that Henry VIII likely died from complications related to his leg ulcers and obesity. The most probable immediate cause was sepsis, a systemic infection spreading from his chronically infected leg wounds. In his final weeks, the king exhibited symptoms consistent with septic shock, fever, confusion, and eventually organ failure. His obesity and probable diabetes would have compromised his immune system, making him more vulnerable to overwhelming infection. Other contributing factors may have included coronary artery disease, given his diet and sedentary lifestyle in later years, and possible kidney failure, resulting from diabetes or repeated episodes of sepsis. Without modern antibiotics, intensive care, or surgical interventions, the king's prognosis, once sepsis developed, would have been extremely poor. The exact sequence of organ failures that ultimately ended Henry's life remains speculative, but the combination of chronic wounds, systemic infection, and multiple comorbidities associated with extreme obesity provides a plausible medical explanation for his death at a relatively young age by modern standards, though not unusual for the Tudor era. Perhaps Henry VIII's most significant achievement was securing the Tudor succession, despite his tumultuous marital history and the challenges of producing a male heir. When he died, the transition of power to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, proceeded with remarkable smoothness, a testament to the institutional stability Henry had established during his reign. The king's final will, signed on December 30th, 1546, carefully delineated both the succession and the structure of government during Edward's minority. A regency council of 16 men, balanced between conservative and reformist factions, was established to govern until Edward reached majority. The will also confirmed the line of succession established by the Third Succession Act of 1544. After Edward, the throne would pass to Mary, then Elizabeth, and then to the descendants of Henry's younger sister, Mary Tudor, bypassing the Scottish line descended from his elder sister, Margaret. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and maternal uncle to the new king, quickly maneuvered to secure a position of preeminence among the regency councillors. Within days of Henry's death, Seymour had himself appointed Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person, effectively making him the de facto ruler of England. To strengthen his position, he also had himself created Duke of Somerset. Despite this concentration of power, which went beyond what Henry had envisioned, the basic framework established by the late king's will remained intact. There was no serious challenge to Edward's right to the throne, and the administrative machinery of government continued to function effectively. Henry's religious legacy was complex and contradictory. Though he had broken with Rome and established the Church of England with himself as supreme head, he had maintained many traditional Catholic practices and doctrines. This ambiguous settlement left unresolved tensions that would play out dramatically in the years following his death. Under Edward VI, guided by Somerset and Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, England moved decisively toward Protestant reform. The 1549 Act of Uniformity established the first Book of Common Prayer, mandating English-language services throughout the realm. Images and altars were removed from churches, clerical celibacy was ended, and Protestant theology increasingly shaped religious practice. These reforms, more radical than anything Henry had contemplated, provoked resistance in many parts of England. In 1549, the Western Rebellion erupted in Cornwall and Devon, with rebels demanding the restoration of traditional religious practices. This uprising, along with Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk the same year, revealed the social and religious tensions simmering beneath the surface of Tudor society. The pace of religious change accelerated after Somerset's fall from power in 1549 and his replacement by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. The Second Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1552, was more explicitly Protestant than its predecessor, and the 42 Articles of 1553 established a clearly reformed doctrinal position for the English Church. Edward VI's premature death in 1553, likely from tuberculosis, triggered the first major test of Henry VIII's succession arrangements. Northumberland, fearing the Catholic restoration that would accompany Mary's accession, attempted to place Lady Jane Grey, Henry's great-niece, on the throne. This bid failed within days, as popular support rallied to Mary, Henry's daughter and lawful heir, according to his will and the Act of Succession. Mary's accession marked a dramatic reversal of the religious policies pursued under Edward. Within months, the Edwardian religious settlement was dismantled, and England was formally reconciled with Rome. Over the next 5 years, nearly 300 Protestants were executed for heresy, earning the Queen the posthumous epithet Bloody Mary, though this number pales in comparison to the thousands executed during her father's reign for various offenses. Mary's determination to restore Catholicism reflected both personal conviction and political calculation. Raised as a devout Catholic by her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary had suffered humiliation and hardship after Henry's break with Rome and annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Her religious policies sought to undo what she viewed as her father's tragic error, returning England to the true faith. Bookmark: Elizabeth and the Settlement. When Mary died childless in November 1558, the crown passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, Henry VIII's daughter, by Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's succession marked the third change of monarch and religious direction in just over a decade, highlighting the dynastic and religious instability that had followed Henry's death. Elizabeth I, perhaps the most politically astute of Henry's children, recognized the need to establish a religious settlement that could accommodate the diverse beliefs of her subjects while maintaining political stability. The Elizabethan religious settlement, established through the 1559 Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, created a distinctively English church that was neither fully Protestant nor Catholic, but incorporated elements of both traditions. This middle way reflected Elizabeth's pragmatic approach to governance, but also echoed aspects of her father's religious policies. Like Henry, Elizabeth insisted on royal supremacy over the church, while maintaining some traditional practices and ceremonies. Unlike Henry, however, she had no personal attachment to Catholic doctrine and allowed Protestant theology to shape the Church's teachings, albeit in a moderate form. Elizabeth's long reign, 1558 to 1603, brought a measure of stability after the tumultuous decades following Henry's death. Under her leadership, the Tudor dynasty reached its apogee, with England emerging as a major European power and experiencing a flowering of culture, exemplified by writers like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Yet even as Elizabeth consolidated Tudor rule, the dynastic concerns that had haunted her father persisted. Her decision to remain unmarried, the Virgin Queen, meant that the Tudor line would end with her death. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-grandson of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, ironically bringing to the English throne the Scottish lineage that Henry had explicitly excluded from his succession plans. Henry VIII's reign marked a revolutionary transformation in the English state and society. Though not always the initiator of change, he relied heavily on advisors like Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell. Henry ultimately approved and implemented policies that fundamentally altered England's religious, political, and social landscape. The break with Rome represented the most dramatic aspect of this transformation. By rejecting papal authority and establishing himself as supreme head of the Church of England, Henry effectively nationalized religion, bringing under royal control an institution that had previously answered to an external authority. This assertion of royal supremacy significantly expanded the power of the English monarchy and laid the foundation for the development of the Anglican Church. The dissolution of the monasteries, implemented between 1536 and 1541, constituted one of the most massive transfers of property in English history. Monastery lands and wealth, comprising perhaps 20 to 25% of England's landed wealth, were seized by the Crown and subsequently sold or granted to members of the gentry and nobility. This redistribution created a class of landowners with a vested interest in maintaining the religious changes instituted under Henry, helping to ensure that England would not return permanently to the Catholic fold. Henry's reign also witnessed significant developments in government administration and legal frameworks. The Reformation Parliament, 1529 to 1536, passed an unprecedented volume of legislation, much of it designed to implement and legitimize the king's religious policies. Acts like the Statute of Uses, 1536, and the Statute of Wills, 1540, transformed property law, while new treason statutes expanded the definition of crimes against the state, reflecting Henry's increasingly autocratic approach to governance. The Tudor administrative state grew substantially during Henry's reign. New bodies like the Privy Council evolved to manage the increasingly complex business of government, while the Court of Augmentations was established specifically to handle the wealth flowing from dissolved monasteries. These institutional developments laid the groundwork for the modern English state, creating bureaucratic structures that would endure long after the Tudor dynasty had ended. Henry VIII's legacy has been shaped not only by his actions, but also by how he has been remembered and portrayed over the centuries. The Tudor myth, developed during Elizabeth I's reign and perpetuated by historians and dramatists, presented the Tudor dynasty as bringing order and prosperity after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Within this narrative, Henry figured as a larger-than-life monarch whose excesses and cruelties were overshadowed by his role in establishing English independence from Rome and securing the Tudor succession. Shakespeare's history plays, particularly Henry VIII, contributed to this mythologizing process, portraying the king in a generally favorable light while acknowledging his complex character. By the time Hans Holbein the Younger's imposing portrait of Henry became the definitive image of the king in the popular imagination, hands on hips, legs planted firmly apart, gaze direct and challenging, the transformation of the historical Henry into a semi-mythical figure was well underway. This mythologizing process continued in subsequent centuries. The Victorian historian James Anthony Froude portrayed Henry as an essentially benevolent ruler, whose actions, however ruthless, were necessary for England's development as a modern nation-state. Later historians like G.R. Elton emphasized Henry's role in the Tudor Revolution in government, presenting him as a modernizing monarch who laid the foundations for the English administrative state. More recent scholarship has offered a more nuanced assessment. Revisionist historians like J.J. Scarisbrick and David Starkey have highlighted the contradictions in Henry's character and policies, emphasizing the extent to which his personal desires, particularly his quest for a male heir, drove political and religious changes. Feminist historians have focused attention on Henry's treatment of his 6 wives, analyzing his marriages within the context of Tudor gender politics and power relations. The bizarre circumstances of Henry's death, the grotesque transformation of the once athletic king into a morbidly obese tyrant barely able to move, have proven especially fertile ground for historical speculation and psychological analysis. His physical decline has been interpreted variously as divine punishment, the result of medical conditions unknown in Tudor times, or the natural consequence of his indulgent lifestyle. These interpretations reflect not only evolving medical knowledge, but also changing cultural attitudes toward obesity, disability, and the relationship between physical and moral health. Henry VIII's reign marked a significant development in England's military capabilities, particularly in naval power. Often called the father of the English Navy, Henry expanded the royal fleet from just 5 ships at his accession to more than 50 by the end of his reign. He established dockyards at Woolwich, Deptford, and Portsmouth, and founded Trinity House to improve navigation and pilot training. The king's interest in military technology led to substantial investment in artillery and fortifications. He imported gun founders from continental Europe, established foundries at the Tower of London, and built a chain of coastal fortresses designed to resist artillery bombardment. These device forts, or Henrician castles, characterized by their low, rounded profiles and gun ports, represented the cutting edge of military architecture in the early 16th century. In foreign policy, Henry initially sought to assert England's position as a major European power through alliances with the Holy Roman Empire and prestigious military campaigns against France. The Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, a lavish summit meeting with Francis I of France, exemplified Henry's determination to present himself as an equal to Europe's most powerful monarchs. As his reign progressed, however, pragmatic concerns increasingly shaped Henry's foreign policy. The break with Rome fundamentally altered England's international position, isolating the kingdom diplomatically and raising the threat of a Catholic coalition against the newly Protestant nation. Henry responded by fortifying the coast, building alliances with German Protestant princes, and pursuing a more cautious, defensive foreign policy. By the time of Henry's death, England remained vulnerable to potential Catholic invasion, but had begun the transformation from a second-tier European power to the naval and commercial giant it would become under Elizabeth I and her Stuart successors. This transformation, while not complete during Henry's lifetime, owed much to his investment in naval power and coastal defenses. The economic consequences of Henry's policies were profound and contradictory. The dissolution of the monasteries injected enormous wealth into royal coffers, but led to long-term financial problems as Henry squandered much of this windfall on military campaigns, palace construction, and court extravagance. By the end of his reign, despite having seized church wealth equivalent to perhaps 5 years of ordinary royal income, Henry left the crown deeply in debt, forcing his successors to resort to currency debasement and other desperate financial measures. The social impact of the dissolution extended beyond economics. Monasteries had provided crucial social services, including health care for the sick, alms for the poor, and education for children of all social classes. Their disappearance created a vacuum that neither the state nor the Reformed Church fully filled, contributing to social dislocation and unrest in the decades following Henry's death. Other Henrician policies had similarly mixed effects. The Statute of Artificers attempted to regulate labor relations and apprenticeship, while the Poor Laws began to establish a framework for addressing poverty, issues that would preoccupy Tudor and Stuart governments for generations. These measures reflected an increasing royal concern with social and economic regulation, expanding state authority into areas previously governed by local custom or ecclesiastical institutions. Henry's reign also witnessed significant inflation, partly resulting from his debasement of the currency to finance military campaigns. This great debasement, which reduced the silver content of English coins by up to 50%, caused prices to rise sharply, creating hardship for wage laborers and those on fixed incomes. Landlords responded by raising rents and converting arable land to sheep pasture, further disrupting traditional rural economies and contributing to rural poverty and displacement. These economic and social changes, while not all directly attributable to Henry's policies, occurred under his watch and formed part of his complex legacy. They reflected the transition from medieval to early modern economic and social structures. A transition that, like the religious and political changes of Henry's reign, brought both benefits and costs to different segments of English society. The bizarre death of Henry VIII Tudor, a once athletic king reduced to immobility and constant pain, carried from room to room as infections festered in his swollen legs, serves as a powerful metaphor for the contradictions that defined his life and reign. The young Renaissance prince who began his rule with such promise ended his days as a bloated tyrant, feared by his courtiers and isolated by his infirmities. Yet beneath the grotesque spectacle of Henry's physical decline lay a more complex reality. Even in his final years, ravaged by pain and increasingly erratic in judgment, Henry maintained a firm grip on the machinery of state. His careful arrangements for the succession and the minority government of his son reflected a mind still capable of strategic thinking and concern for the future of the Tudor dynasty. The transformation of Henry VIII from athletic youth to morbidly obese tyrant invites both medical and psychological analysis. Modern diagnoses, from diabetes to traumatic brain injury, may explain aspects of his physical and mental deterioration, but they cannot fully account for the man behind the symptoms. The king's obesity reflected not just metabolism, but monarchical privilege. His cruelty stemmed not only from possible brain injury, but from the corrupting effects of absolute power. His paranoia grew not just from physical pain, but from the genuine political threats that surrounded his revolutionary religious policies. Henry's legacy, like his character, defies simple categorization. The king who broke with Rome did not consider himself a Protestant and persecuted those who embraced Lutheran doctrines. The monarch who executed 2 of his wives and countless nobles and commoners was also a patron of humanist learning and Renaissance culture. The ruler who expanded royal authority to unprecedented levels operated within a legal framework, insisting that his most controversial actions receive parliamentary approval. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Henry's legacy lies in the concept of English exceptionalism. The idea that England would chart its own course, religiously and politically, separate from continental Europe. His assertion of national sovereignty against papal authority, while motivated by personal desires rather than nationalist ideology, established a precedent for English independence that would shape the nation's self-conception for centuries. The 6 times married king who obsessively pursued a male heir would likely be surprised that his greatest successor proved to be his second daughter, Elizabeth I, who completed many of the religious and political transformations begun under her father. Elizabeth's reign represented a more moderate, pragmatic implementation of Henrician principles, royal supremacy in church and state, balanced by recognition of the need for popular consent and institutional continuity. As the bloated body of Henry VIII was lowered into its vault at Windsor in February 1547, few of the mourners could have predicted the tumultuous religious and political oscillations that would follow over the next decades. Yet the foundations Henry had laid, a nationalized church, an expanded state apparatus, a nobility tied to the crown through redistribution of monastic lands, proved remarkably durable. Despite the religious reversals under Mary I and the more moderate Protestantism of Elizabeth I, the essential structure of the Henrician settlement remained intact. 5 centuries after his death, Henry VIII remains one of history's most recognizable and controversial monarchs. His physical transformation from athletic prince to grotesquely obese king serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of power and privilege. Yet his institutional legacy, the Church of England, the framework of the modern British state, the concept of parliamentary sovereignty, continues to shape the modern world. The bizarre death of Henry VIII, with all its medical mysteries and political machinations, thus offers more than a gruesome historical curiosity. It provides a lens through which to examine the complex relationship between personal health and public power, between physical decline and political legacy, between the mortal king and the immortal crown. In the strange twilight of Henry's reign, as the once mighty monarch lay immobile while courtiers whispered and plotted around him, we can glimpse the fundamental tension at the heart of monarchy itself. The contrast between the frail human who wears the crown and the enduring institution they temporarily embody. Perhaps the final irony of Henry's story is that this most physically imposing of English kings, who worked so hard to project an image of masculine strength and virility, is now remembered as much for his grotesque physical decline as for his political achievements. The king who commissioned magnificent portraits emphasizing his power and majesty could never have imagined that future generations would be fascinated by the intimate details of his festering leg ulcers and expanding waistline. Yet in this very contradiction lies the essence of Henry VIII, a monarch whose outsized appetites, whether for food, power, wives, or religious revolution, transformed both his body and his realm in ways that continue to fascinate and disturb us nearly 5 centuries after his death.